Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Eric Sprankle. He is a professor of clinical psychology at Minnesota State University, Mankato. And today we're talking about his book, DIY, The Wonderfully Weird History and Science of Masturbation. So, Dr. Sprankle, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Yeah, my pleasure as well. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so I mean, this is a very particular kind of topic, masturbation, but why did you feel the need to write a book about it? And what is basically the premise of your book?
Sure. Yeah, I wasn't expecting to write this book. It wasn't like a part of my 5-year academic plan or anything like that. It just kind of fell into my lap through social media. I was posting some things about masturbation, some things I thought were pretty non-controversial to talk about. And I started receiving a lot of comments from random people about how I was being unprofessional and unethical because I wasn't warning my followers and fans about all the dangers about masturbation, things like depression and social anxiety and losing testosterone and muscle mass and all these things that I wasn't too familiar with of hearing,
Yeah.
especially the psychological parts of like depression and social anxiety. And so I did a quick kind of look around of like, where is this coming from? What's fueling these beliefs? And that I just went down a lot of rabbit holes and I started, jotting some things down and it turned into a book outline and I went from there.
Awesome. So, I mean, of course, you cover the history and science of masturbation in your book, as the subtitle mentions. So, uh, let's go through some of the history and then the science later on. So,
Mhm.
and let's start perhaps not so much with the human history of masturbation, but what perhaps we could call the biological history or the deep history of masturbation. So, is masturbation common in the animal kingdom?
Yeah, I don't know how to quantify common given the number of organisms on this planet, but it's certainly not a rare occurrence, especially among a lot of mammals. Um, and there's like myths about, oh, only captive animals masturbate as kind of an anti-masturbation message of like, oh, it's not natural. If you're confined, then you do it. But out in the wild where you're supposed to be, you don't see it. And that's not true at all. There's plenty of instances, observed instances of wild animals masturbating. And one, just for an example, just from a few years ago, this was actually after I finished the draft of my book, so it's not included in it, but there was a walrus that went ashore along a beach in this town on the eastern coast of England on New Year's Eve. I believe it was 2023, maybe 2022, one of those. And it just started masturbating along the beach, and it was such a spectacle in the town that the town had planned fireworks celebration that night for New Year's, and they decided to respect the masturbating walrus and they canceled the fireworks show and not to disrupt them. And eventually, this was a walrus that was being tracked too. His name was Thor, and eventually he just went back into the North Sea on his journey. So yeah, there's plenty of instances of animals masturbating. We're not unique in that. We are unique in the sense of like we tend to be a little bit more orgasm focused, and it's our ability to fantasize to help with that. But in terms of touching genitals for pleasure, it exists in a lot of species.
But do we know why the species of animals that masturbate, why they do that? I mean, does it serve any particular evolved functions?
Depending on the species. So if we look at one of our the closest relative that we have, bonobo, the pygmy chimpanzee, they express themselves sexually in a lot of ways to reduce tension, to resolve conflicts, just to kind of chill out, and a lot of like motivations for humans as well to masturbate. But otherwise, it's just an artifact of having a sex drive and not necessarily an available partner in your immediate surroundings, and to engage in a solo sexuality in order to satisfy at least some aspect of that drive.
And when it comes to human societies, what do we know about masturbation and the kind of norms, perhaps social norms about masturbation, the kind of beliefs people have about masturbation in more traditional societies, and traditional societies like hunter-gatherers, for example, if we know anything about that, and in early civilization.
Yeah, we don't know anything specifically about masturbation with like hunter-gatherer societies. We can only can assume of what it looked like. But in terms of recorded history and even the ancient civilizations, Greeks, Romans, things like that, there is evidence that masturbation existed within those civilizations, but it wasn't really paid much mind to. It certainly existed void of any kind of sinful prohibition, void of any kind of scare tactics about health effects that we see now, or over at least the past couple of 100 years, of warning that, oh, if you masturbate, X, Y, or Z is going to happen to your body or your mind. It was non-existent in that way. So it was really just kind of an inconsequential behavior at the time. At most, it was the butt of jokes. And so it was kind of viewed as like this secondary or second tier, rather, behavior to partnered sex, which was what should be ideal. And that if you didn't have a partner, then I guess you could masturbate. So there are some jokes about being lonely and masturbating and things like that. But it certainly wasn't used as a scare tactic or anti-masturbation messaging to try to persuade people against it.
But it was not stigmatized or pathologized, or was it?
No, not in those two civilizations that I mentioned. Now, you do have, an ancient one as well within Judaism. And I get more into that with the religious aspect of things, because it was more of a religious prohibition on it. And that has existed for a few thousand years. And so that took on a little bit of a different take on it. And that certainly has influenced Christianity's prohibition against it, and so on and so forth. But within kind of classical Greek Roman times, there wasn't that much of a taboo of it, other than just kind of it being viewed again as like the second tier behavior.
And when was it in history, or perhaps particularly in Western history, because I would imagine that's the one you would focus the most on, that masturbation started being problematized in any way, like, for example, being considered a sin or a disease?
Yeah, so the idea of like a religious prohibition goes back to the story of Onan in the book of Genesis. Now, that wasn't an anti-masturbation like fable in and of itself. It was more of a fable about obedience, and so obeying God's commands and family responsibilities and things like that. But it turned into this message of don't waste your seed, because the story of Onan dealt with Onan's quote unquote spilling his seed upon the ground, as opposed to having an ejaculation within his. This is a long story with Onan, but if you're unfamiliar, his brother died, and God commanded that he continue his brother's family line by marrying and having sex with his dead brother's wife. So this would have been his sister-in-law. And he didn't like the idea of that, didn't mind the sex part, but didn't like the idea of the reproduction part. And so while they were having sex, at the moment of orgasm, he withdrew his penis and spilt his seed upon the ground, and then God killed him for that transgression. And so that, again, that often has been viewed as, oh, this is an anti-masturbation story. But it is actually just like obey God kind of story. But rabbis later, and the religious text, the Talmud, really took time to interpret, well, what does this mean to not spill your seed? What more can we kind of learn from the story of Onan? And they really took the not spilling the seed thing very, very literally, of like, you need to save your seed. It has one purpose only, and that's for the purpose of procreation. Anything less is disobeying God's mandate of what we should be doing with our genitals. And so they created all these different types of rules as a way to avoid spilling seed. And that backed up the progression of, what leads to ejaculation? It's like, well, arousal does, genital stimulation. And so they started putting a lot of prohibitions on these earlier behaviors as a way to avoid even accidental seed spilling, so to speak. And then in Christianity, it wasn't really explicitly mentioned until about the 11th century, mid 11th century, with the Pope at that time, who was the first one to explicitly say that masturbation is a gravely disordered act and a sin, essentially. And that position has been reaffirmed by numerous popes over the past 1,000 years, up into including Pope Benedict about 10 years ago.
How about it being considered some sort of pathology or disease? Has it ever been considered such in medicine or by the medical system or even by, for example, psychiatrists or clinical psychologists?
Yeah, we started seeing the introduction that masturbation is now physically harmful to you, not just spiritually harmful, but physically, around the early 1700s in England.
Yeah.
And what's largely pointed to is this anonymous pamphlet called Onania, which again references that story from the Bible, Onan. And in it, there was still a lot of like preachy, like spiritual warnings about masturbation. You're going to go to hell. It's a slippery slope to other sins. You start touching yourself today, you're going to be thieving and murdering the next time you know it. But this was the first instance of, oh, masturbation is also going to cause depression and change your skin and just prematurely age you. And so all these physical effects now started taking shape. And that had an influence on physicians around that time, both in Europe and into the United States. And you saw writings later in the 1700s and then definitely into the 1800s where otherwise well-respected physicians and even physicians who were pretty ahead of their time in a lot of other areas and were pretty progressive and are still revered that way today, they had these very backwards view on sexuality in general, but in particular masturbation. And so they have a lot of writings too, especially throughout the 1800s, of how masturbation is very, very detrimental to your health.
In your book, you go through the history of crusaders, or what you call crusaders against masturbation. Who are these anti-masturbation crusaders? Of course, I would imagine that some of them would include the ones you've already made reference to there when talking about religious people, for example. And I would imagine some of the claims made by them would track onto also those sort of religious medical claims. But who are them? Who are they?
Yeah, broadly speaking, they're an interesting group, and sometimes they're strange bedfellows because they don't really share much in common ideologically other than this one area. So like you said, definitely the religious moralists who say like this is a sin, this is bad. And sometimes they can get into like some pseudoscientific health claims as well with that, but they're primarily grounded in this belief that masturbation is a sin that's spiritually harmful to you. And then there's a lot of quack doctors, again, going back a couple of hundred years, but still today. And and that was kind of like the surprising thing with the book, that I thought the history piece was going to be separate from talking about the science today. But pretty much the anti-masturbation claims being made today are really just mirrors of what was being said 200 years ago, even by physicians back then, as well as some physicians today. Fortunately, fewer physicians today, but they're still out there. So there are some like, quack physicians. And then there are just like what I consider like the wellness influencers on social media. Those who claim that, oh, if you follow these 5 steps, you're on your way to like physical wellness. And unfortunately, a lot of that advice does get into one's sexuality and ideas of purity and being pure. And this idea that, especially for men, that ejaculating is reducing your testosterone and making it more difficult to gain muscle mass. And you're essentially physically feminizing yourself through ejaculation. And so then you have those wellness influencers, and then kind of indirectly you have some branches of feminism, not all, but some branches, primarily like what's called radical feminism. That I say indirectly because their target is more with pornography and the sex industry, but pornography is for masturbation. And so the issues overlap with that. And then a surprising one too are like white nationalists and white supremacists and others who engage in some types of conspiratorial thinking, and their belief that porn in particular and masturbating to porn is a way to kind of degrade and erode white men and for minorities to take over. So some conspiratorial thinking too.
Yeah, later we're going to go back to some of what you said there. We're going to talk about the NoFap people or
Hmm.
NoFap movement and people who make claims about semen retention, and also the overlap between anti-masturbation and anti-pornography. We're
Hmm.
going to talk about that. But tell us about the figure, because he was a very prominent figure, of John Kellogg.
Mm.
I mean, what did he represent in terms of anti-masturbation?
Yeah, so John Kellogg was a physician at the late 1800s, early 1900s. He was part of
Yeah.
a psychiatric hospital. It's called a sanitarium at that time in Michigan in the United States. And he was part of like this kind of wellness and hygiene, purity kind of movement within the health industry at that time. So he was a big proponent of kind of experimental methods of treating mental illnesses through like hydrotherapy, different types of like interactions with water. Sometimes it can be very like sadistic methods. But he also had a lot of beliefs about how diet influences behavior. And he was very, very caught up with his religious beliefs, and having his religious beliefs inform a lot of his medical opinions, particularly around sex and particularly around masturbation. He viewed masturbation as like the Moloch of the species, and that it was doubly abominable, doubly because it was not only a sin in and of itself, but it's also a sin against your own body. And
Mm,
so he, going with the food piece, he thought introducing a bland diet was the best way to kind of suppress sexual desire, particularly masturbatory desire. And so he actually invented a very bland toasted cornflake in hopes to achieve this goal. And if you haven't put the name and the flake together, this is where kind of essentially the origin story of Kellogg's cornflakes.
mhm.
It was actually
Yeah.
his brother, Will Kellogg, that took the company more commercial. Um, John Kellogg wanted just to keep the cereal as a treatment intervention within his hospital.
Mm.
But nonetheless, that was the initial invention of toasted corn flakes. Fortunately, they have no impact on sexual desire, so feel free to eat those as you please.
And tell us about the practices of circumcising the foreskin of the penis without anesthesia and dousing the clitoris with carbolic acid. I mean, what were the purposes of that?
Yeah, so this was just kind of made in passing in one of John Kellogg's books. Um, So I don't know how widely it was practiced. I didn't look into that. And so I just kind of make
Mm.
a brief reference to it because it was just a brief reference in his book, and I was focused more on him as a character. And essentially his reasoning behind including that and advocating for it, again, whether he actually practiced this or not, was to have the child associate something very negative with their genitals early on as a way to avoid coming in contact with their own genitals through masturbation. So it
Okay.
was just a mechanism of us essentially torturing a child so they would be afraid to touch their genitals because now they associate their genitals with pain.
Do modern or contemporary practices of female genital mutilation have also anything to do with anti-masturbation or not?
I would say less anti-masturbation, more of just like control over sexuality more in general.
Mm,
Yeah,
okay.
and it does, and that is being influenced by different cultural beliefs and practices and what was coming out of John Kellogg. But certainly, the end game or the end goal is the same. It's like let's reduce sexual drive, let's reduce sexual desire, because these genitals should only be used for one very specific purpose.
Yeah.
So that, in the sense, it's there's significant overlap, but the cultural reasoning is pretty significantly different.
Something I learned by reading your book, which before that I wasn't aware of at all, is that there's masturbation in utero, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
how does that happen?
Yeah, so I had heard that. I don't know where, some place along my studies, I had at least heard it. I don't think I've ever read it. So it must have just been during a lecture or something. And I was like, oh, let's see, because I started my book off a little bit with a developmental perspective first of like childhood masturbation. And I was like, well, let's even
Mm,
back up further because I remember hearing this thing at one point in my studies and looking into it. And there's actually quite a bit of research that has gone into observing fetuses in utero masturbating. So through ultrasound technology. The first studies came out of the 80s, and they see a fetus through ultrasound, and they're grasping their penis and making hand movements. Since they have the flexibility and the weightlessness of the amniotic sac, essentially, they've been observed sucking on their own penis. Female fetuses too have been observed masturbating through this technology as well. So it is well documented. And the mechanism behind it can freak people out, be like, whoa, what's going on? We don't normally think of fetuses as being like very sexually active, let alone masturbating during the mother's pregnancy. But, it's at that stage of development, they don't have any sex drive, right? They don't have any kind of endocrine development that would motivate them to seek out sexual stimulation because like they're horny. They don't have that ability. They don't have any cognitive functioning where they're fantasizing about the other like sexy fetuses in Lamaze class or anything like that. They don't have that capacity, right? So what's actually going on is this is just a basic stimulus response. They're moving around, they're squirming in utero, and they happen just through happenstance to come across their genitals in some capacity, and it was reinforcing because it felt good. It was soothing, right? It's no different than observing in utero thumb sucking or other types of body rocking. All it's doing is serving to soothe the individual. Pretty similar to at least one motivation that even adults have with most masturbation is it can be self-soothing. And so we obviously as adults have a lot of motivations, different motivations to masturbate. Fetuses really just kind of have that one. And so that's what's getting documented and observed.
And in regards to childhood masturbation, how does it develop? And is there any problem at all with it?
Yeah, it's developed pretty similarly as it is in utero. It's just through happenstance. They're exploring their bodies, they're exploring their world. Their world only exists within like a couple of feet of them. That's their entire universe. And so, of course, they're going to be exploring through their sensory system of, trying to make sense out of their surroundings. And that includes exploring their own body. And so oftentimes they do not have the dexterity to even manually manipulate their genitals. So a lot of times they come across genital stimulation through crossing their legs or rubbing up against something like in their crib or wherever they may be lying down. And just like anything else, like I mentioned before, it's stimulus response. They do something by accident. It feels good. It's reinforcing. They do it again. And so it starts serving that function of this is just something to feel good to do. And it can be soothing as well. Again, no different than like thumb sucking or body rocking, very common child, infant and toddler types of behaviors. Occasionally, it can be caused by some type of genital infection, like a urinary tract infection, in which the soothing is actually more to soothe the pain. And so there is more of a concerted effort to touch the genitals because they hurt. And then even after the infection goes away and there's no longer pain, the behavior stays around because they learn that this is a soothing behavior. This can feel good. This can alleviate pain. There's no more pain there. So they're just left with, oh, this just feels good. For the most part, this isn't a problem at all. It can be shocking to parents. It can be embarrassing for families, especially once the child is old enough to like walk around and now they're doing this, in the living room during a dinner party in front of grandma and grandpa or something. And so those are instances in which parents can just redirect the behavior of like, there's nothing wrong with that. Let's just not do it in front of grandma. How about we do this by yourself, in your own room or in the bathroom? So that's an opportunity for parents to like just redirect the behavior as opposed to scolding the behavior. But oftentimes parents are quick to kind of have this knee-jerk reaction because they're like shocked and taken aback. And so they can scold and be like, no, don't do that, without the context of like, no, the behavior was fine, just like where you were doing it was not that fine. So, and typically those types of redirections are very effective, right? It may take a couple of trials for that message to kind of sink in of like where this is appropriate to do, where this isn't. If that message isn't sinking in, that could be cause for concern that there's something else going on, why the child isn't able to develop social norms, rules, follow norms, things like that. So that's not like a masturbation problem. That's more of like a developmental kind of problem that should be looked at as to why they aren't learning the differences between appropriate places and inappropriate places.
And how do children learn to be shameful about masturbation and sex more generally?
Yeah, so that's an interesting thing about sex in general, and masturbation in particular, is that
Okay.
it's not an inherently shameful practice. We have to be taught that it's shameful. And
Yeah.
so it can be very easily induced with a lot of shame by that type of reaction I was mentioning earlier of like, the child gets caught by a parent, and instead of like redirecting the behavior, talking about privacy and appropriate places and things like that, it's just met with like, no, don't do that. That's bad. That's wrong. That's sinful. That's bad for you, whatever the case may be, without any further explanation. Then yeah, that's going to start, that's a form of punishment. That's a verbal punishment. In terms of, if we're thinking behaviorism, we have reinforcement, we have punishment. That's going to be a form of
Yeah.
punishment, whereas trying to decrease the frequency of that behavior. And so that drive may still be there for the child to masturbate in some capacity. It feels good, it's soothing, whatever, passes the time, they're bored. But now they're left with, oh, but mom and dad yelled at me last time they saw me do this, and so maybe I shouldn't do this. Or they do it and then they feel guilty and ashamed that they're doing it, right? And so it can be instilled very, very early on in their development. Other times, more subtle ways shame can get introduced is just by not talking about it at all. We live in a culture enough, and I think, whether that's Europe or the United States, we live in a lot of cultures in which sex, and particularly masturbation, just has this cloud of taboo over it for a variety of reasons. And even if we don't hear that specifically, especially from a primary caregiver, we start picking that up through media, picking it up through friends or peer group, that this is something that maybe is a little embarrassing, a little taboo. We shouldn't talk about. No one seems to be talking about it. And the lack of talking is actually a message in and of itself. It is reinforcing the taboo. We're talking about everything else that's going on in our lives, everything else that's going on with our bodies. But this one particular behavior seems to be getting ignored. And so the child starts connecting the dots, is like, well, why is that? That must mean this is something bad. This is something, shameful. And that can start instilling some feelings of shame around it as well.
So earlier you told us about some of the negative attitudes that people from some of the most popular religions in the world, particularly Catholicism, Judaism, have about masturbation.
Mhm.
Does Satanism have anything to do with it?
The Satanism.
Mhm.
Yeah. And so this was one area of the book that my publisher was like, what are you doing here? This seems a little out of left field. I didn't think it was out of left field because I tied in a lot of like those religions, especially with Christianity, how they view oftentimes masturbation is the work of the devil. You're being tempted by Satan. There's a lot of these beliefs of like you're going to hell. And so I wanted to actually incorporate Satan in the form of the new religious movement, Satanism, be like, oh, okay, like, well, what do they think about masturbation? And it is the opposite of that.
Yeah.
Pretty much that masturbation is just part of bodily autonomy, and if it feels good, you want to do it, do it. If you have no interest in it, then don't do it. It's pretty much like do what thou wilt, right? It's your own body. Who cares? You shouldn't have these arbitrary rules placed on you when it doesn't have any impact on anybody else but you.
Mhm. So let's talk then about the NoFap movement, semen retention, and influences around it. So, what kinds of claims do they make about masturbation, and what are the physical and what do they say about what are the supposed physical benefits of masturbation abstinence?
Yeah, so kind of got into this a little bit earlier with the origin of the book. So because that was coming from semen retentionists. So
Mhm.
semen retentionist is anybody who thinks that it's important for your physical health, your mental well-being to retain your semen by not ejaculating. No
Yeah.
fap people, fapping, the slang term for masturbation, fapping, so just no fap, so abstaining from masturbation. There's the capital N and F in that of NoFap. That's more the established group that started off on, I believe, Reddit, and they definitely have a presence all over different social media platforms. But NoFap, lowercase, has just kind of turned into shorthand for not wanting to masturbate for some type of ideological or health reason. So they're definitely anti-masturbation, and they think masturbation is harmful to your body, and therefore, by extension, that abstaining from masturbation is healthy for your body and can promote wellness. And so they think that masturbation causes depression, social anxiety, loss of testosterone, and therefore a loss of muscle mass. They think it decreases motivation, and so you are less likely to get a girlfriend, get married, have children. They definitely believe that it causes brain damage, primarily by watching pornography. They think it leads to sexual dysfunction, primarily in the form of erectile difficulties, so ED. So all these different things. And then the reverse is true, that if you abstain, you're going to have high levels of testosterone, muscle gain. You're going to have the confidence and motivation to seek out job opportunities, relationships, dating, children, all these things. You're going to have the best sexual functioning. So all these things. The problem is none of that's real. It's all misinformation. And a lot of it is just complete nonsense. I don't even know where it originated from. Other times, it's a misinterpretation of some studies that they think are claiming to support that masturbation is harmful in this way. But it's an inaccurate reading of the research. So this is what you have to keep in mind. Like these research studies that sometimes are freely available online, which I think is ultimately a good thing, but you have to be a trained scientist to understand like a lot of it and be able to make sense out of like, what are these claims? What was the methodology? How does this one article fit into the body of literature within this whole topic, right? The average layperson does not have those skills, right? Because it is a skill set that scientists had to train for. And so they read these studies, they think, oh, this study shows that testosterone drop over a period of abstinence. That must mean masturbation is bad for your testosterone, and abstaining from masturbation indefinitely is going to boost your testosterone. And there are a couple of studies that looked at testosterone and abstinence, but it's not claiming actually what these semen retentionists think. So a lot of it's just scientific illiteracy and not being able to accurately interpret data.
So you said then that all at least their most common claims regarding increasing anxiety, depression, lower motivation, lower levels of testosterone and all of that, that they are wrong. So what do we know scientifically about masturbation? I mean, what can you tell us scientifically about it? What are the health benefits, and are there any negatives at all for health, for psychological health, or anything like that?
For the most part, masturbation is just a brief moment of pleasure, and it's largely inconsequential, right? It's not going to be necessary for optimal health, and it's not going to be a detriment to your health either, right? So I think we have to be cautious, people in my field, in the sexual health field within psychology, not to oversell masturbation. I kind of get into this at the end of my book when I was starting to see a lot of other sex therapists, sex researchers, sex educators start making some lofty claims about the benefits, the health benefits of masturbation, and be like, I think that's a little bit of a stretch to generalize, right? Results may vary, and that's the important thing. There are mechanisms with orgasm, not unique to masturbation, but orgasm in general. The biochemical processes, the neurobiochemical processes involved with having an orgasm, yeah, that could be related to lower levels of stress, improved sleep, temporary decreases in experiencing pain. It can even decrease nasal congestion, right? There's all these factors that go on in our body during an orgasm and afterwards that would explain why somebody may have those outcomes and effects and feel as if, you know, their nasal congestion was reduced after an orgasm, or they always sleep better when they masturbate right before bed, right? So there are explanations as to why that would be, scientific explanations, and for those people that would be viewed as obviously as like a benefit. but results may vary. Not everybody feels that way after masturbating. It can just certainly be, like I mentioned, for most people, just kind of like this inconsequential behavior, other than the consequence being pleasure. And that's the number one motivator to masturbate. There have been some studies that looked at what are all your motivations to masturbate. And there were things that I just mentioned, more health related things like improve sleep, decrease stress, unwind, relax, reduce pain, especially from menstrual cramps, things like that. But the number one reason by far was I masturbate because it feels good. And that's all it needs to be. Now, the opposite of that, are there any health effects negatively? And it could be. Other than like extreme cases, right? I want to keep this grounded in reality where, like, hypothetically someone's masturbating 300 times a day with sandpaper. It's like, yeah, that's probably going to have a negative impact on your genitals, right? But let's keep this more in kind of reality. The more likely negative effects are going to be psychological. And these are going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, largely. And it's known as moral incongruence. This is what happens when you have this belief of something is bad, it's wrong, it's immoral, it's a sin, I shouldn't be doing this, but you do it anyways. That creates this incongruence between your values and your behavior. And this incongruence has been associated with a lot of different types of psychological distress, which it makes sense, right? You're doing something that you told yourself you should not be doing. And so you can feel shame, you can feel guilt, embarrassment, things like that. And so that's not going to be healthy for an individual to feel bad about their own behaviors.
Yeah. Does moral incongruence link to people identifying as masturbation addicts?
Yeah, 100%. It's one. Sometimes depending on the study, one of the top predictors of those who self-label as a masturbation addict or a porn addict, what's driving that is not so much the frequency in which they are masturbating. So it's not like everybody who claims to be a masturbation addict is masturbating 10, 15 times a day. Oftentimes they're just masturbating once a day, a couple of times a week, something that's very normal for somebody else that they don't view it as a problem at all. It's not impacting their life. But for somebody with moral incongruence, when they've told themselves, I should not be doing this at all, just doing it once can create this incongruence and this distress. And if you're doing something you told yourself I shouldn't be doing, how do you make sense out of that? Well, I'm out of control. I must be addicted to it. Because why else would I be doing this if I wasn't addicted? I want to stop. I want to cut back, but I can't. So again, less about frequency. It could just be once a week that they're doing it, that they're trying to stop. And they're more likely to label themselves as a masturbation addict as a result.
And this moral incongruence, I mean, the sources of it might be religious beliefs against masturbation and some of these other beliefs put forth by, for example, the NoFap people and the anti-masturbation crusaders.
Yeah, 100%. It's largely fueled by religious beliefs about masturbation. But I mean, from a secular perspective and religious beliefs aside, you could have, so what was very common when I used to do clinical work before getting into academia, I can't recall more than like 2 patients I ever saw. And I was I was a psychologist at a sexual health clinic, and a large program that we had was dealing with what was called, at the time at least, compulsive sexual behavior. And so a lot of those guys were, they were what they thought they were masturbating too much, watching porn and masturbating too much, things like that. I can only think of like 2 instances in which the patients were single and came in, like single as in like not having a partner, a girlfriend or a spouse. So all the other guys were coming in because this was causing problems in the relationship. If they were single, it wasn't going to be a problem, but it was an issue in the relationship. So you can also have this moral incongruence where it doesn't fit the values of the relationship more so than the individual. And so if the relationship, if your partner is saying, I'm not comfortable with you masturbating, I think it's a form of cheating, I get insecure because I think, like, why are you masturbating if we could be having sex? Are you unsatisfied? It just creates a lot of what I think is unnecessary stress on the relationship. But this is a reality for a lot of couples of how they feel about one partner masturbating or looking at porn. And so they have this rule, or a lot of times it's even an unspoken rule, that masturbation, especially masturbating to porn, should not be happening in this relationship. But of course, the person does it anyways. And so that creates that same incongruence. They're doing something that they know they shouldn't be doing, but are doing it anyways. They can feel guilt, shame, embarrassment. And if they get caught, which they often do, then you have a pretty significant relationship conflict on your hands. So that's outside of any kind of religious teaching, because that can just maybe a relationship rule that has nothing to do with religion. But even with the single guys, a lot of the NoFap guys are actually not religious at all. And so their belief is more about how this is impacting their body. And so they just really buy into a lot of the health misinformation. And so they don't want to masturbate for that reason. They're scapegoating masturbation as a reason why they don't have bigger muscles, why they don't have the girlfriend that they want, maybe why they don't have the job that they want, right? So masturbation is pointed to as, this is why, cut out masturbation, you'll start seeing improvements in all areas of your life. So they take that on themselves. That's their new goal, like their fitness goal almost. And if they slip, which they always do, then they're going to feel really bad about themselves and label themselves as a sex addict because they're doing something that they had prohibited for themselves.
When it comes to incongruence that stems from relationship values because your partner is not comfortable with you masturbating, is there anything that people can do about it? I mean, to deal with that in their own relationship?
Yeah, this can be complex because, this often relies on couples therapy to really kind of understand what is the opposition to masturbation. What is this actually about? A lot of times, even like masturbation itself isn't the scapegoat, but what's bringing people into therapy is porn. That, oh, my partner is watching porn, he's a porn addict, he needs to not watch this at all, this is causing problems in our relationship. And that's where you start as a couples therapist, of like working through, okay, like, what does this look like, what are your values around this? But it's pretty clear, and this was certainly my experience doing clinical work, that it's less about the porn and more about the masturbation. So if you take porn out of the equation, it's like, okay, are you comfortable with your partner just masturbating to fantasy? And typically, no. And so the issue wasn't about whether their eyes were open looking at a screen or closed playing a fantasy in their own mind. The problem was that they had a solo sex life, or a sex life that didn't include them, right, as their partner, right? And that brought up the same stuff, like, are you dissatisfied? I think this is a form of cheating. I'm not comfortable with you experiencing sexual pleasure without me, kind of all these things, right? And there's no right or wrong there, of like which partner is right, which values do you have to adhere to. But the couples work then is like, is there any kind of middle ground? Can we explore this enough of like, what could be a reasonable solution to this if this person desires masturbation, but you are adamantly opposed to it? And there may not be a resolution. And this could be a relationship killer for some, that they just cannot see eye to eye, and it's just going to lead to secrecy and continuous violations of trust and betrayal. But for others, there may be like some type of middle ground of like where it's at least out in the open. Because a lot of what's damaging with this within relationships is the secret keeping, that the one partner is secretly masturbating to porn, and then they get caught, and it's like, oh, this is what you were doing in here, I thought you were doing something else. So it's a completely different perception of what your partner's doing, if they're doing something in secret that they're intentionally hiding from you. So that's oftentimes the most destructive element with this, is just the secrecy, and less so about the porn, less so about the masturbation. And so for those couples, it's like, okay, can we acknowledge that masturbation exists in this relationship, and one of you or both of you do enjoy masturbating from time to time? For the most part, it does not influence the relationship in any way. We can explore how masturbation meets certain needs that partnered sex does not, just as partnered sex meets certain needs that masturbation cannot. They're separate behaviors. And if they can all agree on that, then the issue isn't secret anymore, but they can still have a sense of privacy, that they can masturbate in private, but it's no longer a secret. There's no way of like, quote unquote, getting caught.
But does that tend to be a frequent issue in relationships where one of the partners masturbates and the other doesn't? Or Is it, or do you find that most couples tend to just deal well with it or not care about it? I mean,
Yeah, it's a little bit of a mixed bag, and perspectives are skewed because a lot of times questions are asked this to clinicians, myself included. So we're seeing where it already kind of exploded in relationships. So we're kind of dealing possibly just with one type of dynamic. But oftentimes it is either just one partner does it and the other doesn't at all. Other times one partner watches porn and masturbates, the other person just masturbates and doesn't watch porn.
okay.
And then other times it can be a frequency discrepancy of like, oh, they're masturbating several times a week. Whereas like, I'm not against masturbation, but I only do it like once a month. And so that's more of like a desire discrepancy that's very common in relationships, but more so a desire discrepancy about how often you have partnered sex. But those desire discrepancies can also play out with masturbation because we can start making assumptions about our partner based on their frequency of masturbation. So it can come out in a couple of different ways.
But on the topic of masturbation addiction, is there really such a thing, or is it just simply a matter of moral or relationship incongruence?
For how we think about addiction, it doesn't really line up that well with masturbation or with porn, right? So if we think of substance use and substance use disorders, of experiencing intoxication from the substance and then continuing to seek out that feeling of intoxication to the point that we're developing a tolerance, and we develop that tolerance over time, and that we need to start taking more of the substance more frequently or in higher doses in order to get that same feeling of intoxication. And then if we develop that tolerance and stop, we have some type of withdrawal syndrome. That's not playing out with masturbation. Physiologically, it does not play out in that way. There's not tolerance, there's not withdrawal. It may feel difficult to, if you're a daily masturbator, then to stop masturbating, but that's not a withdrawal syndrome of your body's like used to orgasms. Because what's the half-life of an orgasm? It's just a couple of seconds, right? Whereas you ingest cocaine or heroin, it has a much longer half-life in your body where you're experiencing the effects of it. So in a lot of ways, it does not operate similarly to addiction. And so I certainly do not categorize it in that way. But I want to say that can people experience significant problems in their life, in their relationships, because of masturbation? Absolutely. Right. And so that's where it kind of gets more into that moral incongruence thing. And that can certainly be destructive in someone's life. And that is related to masturbation, obviously, but it's more related to their attitudes toward masturbation and the conflict now up against their masturbatory behavior. The other avenue in which to explore that's clinically relevant is what's called emotional regulation or dysregulation. And that's shown up in the literature too, of the self-described like porn addicts or sex addicts, that if it's not related to this moral incongruence, there can be some motivation for emotional regulation, that they have a lot of stress that may not be diagnosable. It's just kind of general stress, or it could be a diagnosable condition of a mood disorder, an anxiety disorder, something that is psychiatric for them, that they're looking for coping mechanisms. And there's nothing inherently wrong, obviously, with looking for coping mechanisms. We all need them. And masturbation can be that. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. People get into problems with masturbation if it's their only coping mechanism, right? And especially if you have high levels of stress, psychiatric disorders in which you need a whole array of coping strategies to deal with your symptoms, to better manage your symptoms. If you're only relying on masturbation, that's where you're going to start seeing some compulsive use of it, some high frequency use, some use in inappropriate places. You're stressed out at work, you masturbate at work. Looking at porn on your work computer, going to get in trouble, at your job, right? That's all kind of looked at as, oh, you're a porn addict, you're a sex addict because you looked at this at work, you're out of your mind. It's like, well, digging a little bit deeper, the function of that behavior was emotional regulation, right? To regulate a dysregulated body. So we can see it that like the masturbation, and whether it's to porn or not, it's more of a function to alleviate symptoms of some other type of pathology.
Right. Just going back for a second to the NoFap people, and I mean, in this particular case, I heard this kind of claim not only from them, but also from some of the other anti-masturbation crusaders, because they say that it's, or some of them claim that it's not just masturbation that is harmful, but even ejaculation itself. I mean,
Mhm.
uh, why wouldn't, if that's the case, why wouldn't it also be harmful to ejaculate during sex? Does this
Right.
make any sense at all?
No, it doesn't make sense. There's only been a couple of people throughout like this anti-masturbation health crusade over the past couple of years that were ideologically consistent. Franklin Graham, he was a reverend in New England in the early 1800s. He was consistent thinking that any orgasm was bad for your body, right? So at least that made sense. Like if you think having an orgasm and particularly ejaculating is doing all this physical damage to your body, and like what you said, well, wouldn't that happen with intercourse just as much as it would during masturbation? And like, yeah, it should. And so
Yeah.
Graham recognized that. But a lot of others do not, especially today. It's rare to see that distinction made. Or lack of distinction, rather. Usually what you see today is that no, masturbation is physically harmful to you. Ejaculation from masturbation is physically harmful to you, but partnered sex is healthy for you, right? You need to strive to do that because that's what nature has intended for you. That's what God has intended for you, whatever their underlying argument is. Physiologically, it doesn't really matter. There are some differences in terms of how we make sense out of situations, right? That's
Yeah.
why, we can get certain needs met with a partner sexually that we can't individually, and vice versa.
Yeah.
So there's some like, relational needs that get met. There's some bonding. There's some feelings of closeness with partnered sex that aren't necessarily there with masturbation. But in terms of the physical mechanism of expelling semen from your body, that semen doesn't care if it's going inside of a vagina or landing on an iPad. Physiologically, no difference.
And do people also report better orgasms during sex than during masturbation?
I've seen some studies that try to look at that, and yeah, there has been greater satisfaction with partnered sex
Mhm.
orgasms than solo sex. Um, but then you hear, other studies. I haven't seen like any empirical data on this, so they're left with just anecdotes, which are not data, but saying that I can only climax from solo sex, right? Primarily women, right? That masturbation is my only means to orgasm. Or if they can't orgasm with a partner, it's kind of like, it took forever and it finally got there. And I was like, yeah, okay, but masturbating with my vibrator, consistent, reliable, and very, very intense orgasms, right? But the
Yeah.
research on guys has shown that subjectively, obviously, this is subjective experience, that masturbation is kind of second tier to partnered sex. Now,
Yeah.
whether, and it's impossible to kind of measure that unless they are hooked up to physiological reading equipment that would measure the intensity of the muscle contractions during orgasm, and is that different than with a partner? So maybe there are physiological differences, but my guess would be it's more of a perceptual difference, right?
Mm.
That having sex with a
Okay.
partner, having an orgasm with a partner has a lot more reinforcers attached to it, a lot less taboo attached to it. So the perception is it's a lot more enjoyable.
Are there any other ways apart from moral incongruence and relationship incongruence that people might feel bad after masturbation?
Um, well, those are the drivers
Mhm.
of why they may feel bad. The mechanism of which they may feel bad oftentimes is legit, and it's not just they're making it up.
Yeah.
And I didn't think that interacting with some of these guys early on in the book development, when they were telling me that they feel depressed and amotivated, a little socially anxious after they had an orgasm from masturbation. I didn't think they were making that up. I believe that that's what they felt. And my belief with this is that it operates similarly to how a lot of somatic disorders exist. So for those unfamiliar, somatic disorders is a category of mental disorders that include things like, in layman's terms, like being a hypochondriac. right?
Mm.
That you, whether or not there's actually something physically there, you interpret it as something very, very wrong with you. You know, a headache isn't just like, oh, I have tension today, right? A headache is an indication that you have a brain tumor, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes you may not even have anything detectable that a physician could find wrong with you, but you're convinced that, you know, something is wrong with you, right? So whether there is an underlying factor or not, this is all kind of like a manifestation of a somatic disorder. How this plays out with masturbation and guilt and feeling bad afterwards is that, yeah, the post-orgasm experience does have a plethora of neurotransmitters and hormones involved that are supposed to make you feel at ease, satiated, calm, right? Things like that. And most people interpret that that's a pleasurable experience, as it kind of, you know, took the steam out of the pressure a little bit, or pressure out of the steam, whatever that analogy is. And it satisfied the sexual drive, so you feel satiated, so you feel less driven, at least in this one area. But for those who feel masturbation should be avoided, they could misinterpret those feelings. Same feelings, but instead of feeling satiated and relaxed, they feel unmotivated and depressed. So that's how they're interpreting the sensation of post-orgasm, that it robbed them of all motivation. Not just sexual motivation, but all. Now they can't go to the gym. They can't walk up to women and introduce themselves, right? They feel depressed, even though other people say like, oh, no, this is just kind of feeling relaxed. It's like, no, this feels like depression to me, right? And so those kinds of things can happen. And it's more, I'm not calling it a somatic disorder, but it operates similarly as a somatic disorder.
Okay. So are there people, I mean, I guess there are, but are there particular people, maybe feminists, who start from an anti-porn position and then end up in an anti-masturbation position? And if so, what kinds of claims do they tend to make?
Yeah, the feminist arguments against porn, that's been going on since, you know, at least the 1970s. They've even been known as like the sex wars or the porn wars through the 70s and the 80s. So it's hotly contested. And again, it's not all branches of feminism. There's plenty of branches of feminism that embrace pornography, workers' rights, viewing it more from a, you know, workers' perspective, things like that. So it is a particular ideology within feminism that views pornography as violence against women, degradation against women, exploitation and objectification of women. So those are ideological arguments, right? And you can't debate that scientifically, because that's like debating thinking that porn is a sin. It's like, well, okay, if that's your belief, then that's your belief. I can't point to studies where it says, no, this isn't a sin, right? So the problem is that both with like the religious arguments, the spiritual arguments, and some of the feminist arguments against pornography, they're largely ideological, but oftentimes they kind of cherry pick some empirical evidence, some of the science to support their claims. Oftentimes, like I mentioned earlier, they're selecting articles based on a misunderstanding and misinterpretation of what that study actually is saying. So some scientific illiteracy is going on. But I would say that for the most part, feminist anti-porn arguments don't turn into anti-masturbation arguments as easily as religious anti-porn arguments turn into anti-masturbation. And that's because for the religious ideology, all of it is a sin. Masturbation, porn, watching porn without masturbation, it's all outside of the purview of what God wants for your sexuality. For the feminist argument, it largely is focused on the exploitation of women within pornography and concerns about seeing that, what that's going to do to men in real life and enact aggression against women in real life.
But sometimes they make claims about the effects that watching porn might have on the sexual health of men as well,
Right.
correct?
Yeah, they do, but that's still focused on porn for the most part, and not necessarily
Yeah.
masturbation.
Sure.
Where I do see occasionally a feminist anti-porn argument go into just an anti-masturbation argument, gets into some thought policing of like, okay, take the porn out of the equation, Are you free to masturbate to whatever? It's like, no, well, like, what are you thinking about? Right. And is that those fantasies just similar to the pornography that they oppose to? Does it include instances of male dominance and female submission? Right. So I've seen it sometimes they're concerned about fantasy life during masturbation, and that would be more of an anti-masturbation argument. Similarly, using sex toys, male sex toys for sexual pleasure, of like fleshlights, pocket pussies, especially sex dolls, that comes up with the same arguments, that this is just acting out male dominance against women sexually.
And that it promotes the objectification of women. Right.
Correct. Yeah, and especially with like the sex toys, there isn't really data to support that those fears are true.
Yeah, and they also, and now I want to focus specifically on porn because I mean, there's, of course, you said that there's not a big link between anti-porn feminism and anti-masturbation feminism, but they also make lots of claims about pornography itself that might be wrong. I mean, they also claim that watching porn causes sexual violence. Is there any evidence to support that?
Not overall, right? So there's been a couple of meta-analyses that have been done on this issue, the link between violence and pornography. And for the most part, watching pornography is going to be very inconsequential to a person's own behavior, particularly aggressive and violent behavior. But this is where it gets very nuanced. So, a lot of times anti-porn arguments label all porn bad and that it's going to have a negative effect on all viewers. There's no research to support that whatsoever, not even close, right? So we can't say that porn is inherently harmful to people, and especially in this area that causes violence or aggression, particularly against women. No research to support that. So now we have to look at it a little bit more nuanced of like, well, is there certain types of pornography that could lead to aggressive and violent behavior against women? Or is it more about the viewer? And certain viewers may be more at risk of engaging in violent behavior after watching whatever type of pornography. So it is more about the latter, that it's less about the content in the pornography, even though there has been some links early on about exposure to violent pornography can lead to some, at least attitudinal changes short term in the viewer, of being more accepting against of aggression toward women, more accepting of like rape myths and things like that. But largely looking at the data, we have to look at the individual and the individual watching it. So it's less about the porn and more about who's watching it. And there has been a couple of studies that looked at those who are already at high risk of even recidivism, meaning they've already committed a sex crime and they're at high risk. And there's a lot of factors that go into being at high risk, again, for offending for a second, a third, or a fourth time. Those individuals tend to be a little bit more susceptible to the effects, especially of watching violent pornography, right? So that's a very, very different conversation of like, all porn's bad because men who watch it are going to be aggressive and violent toward women, versus actually those who have already been violent toward women and who have a high propensity to do it again. If they're watching violent porn, that could make them a little bit more susceptible to being engaging in violence in real life. So it goes from very broad to very, very narrow. So unless you're on a sex offender registry already, more than likely you don't have to worry about porn effects, because there's so much that goes into violence that isn't even part of the equation of watching pornography passively, right? It's characteristics that make one aggressive and violent with or without pornography. So those are the factors that are more of a driver for violence against women than pornography alone is.
I always tend to be very skeptical about these kinds of claims of porn causing sexual violence and things like that, because, I mean, we have a very long history of people making claims about particular kinds of content causing violence, like violent movies causing violence, violent video games causing violence, and there's never any even correlation to find there. Right.
Yeah, so like pornography gets scapegoated a lot. It gets scapegoated for a lot of social ills, relational ills, individual ills. And the belief and concern that it's leading to violence is one of the oldest ones in pornography's history, at least modern pornography, of like starting in the 70s and the 80s. But you're right, it's really no different than some of the moral panics that have happened with heavy metal music, with Mortal Kombat in the 90s, right? So that was my era of Mortal Kombat and Doom and heavy metal music, all those things that were around me growing up, and all parents and political commentators were concerned of like, we're all going to turn into like school shooters because of this. And it's like, that's not the driving factor. School shooters aren't bred out of a video game. If that was the case, we would have a lot more shootings than we actually do already. So there has to be other factors at play that actually have nothing to do with the media itself.
Yeah, I mean, even if I remember correctly, even after the Columbine massacre, some people blamed Marilyn Manson and his music for the violence there. So.
Yeah, and the ironic part was with that was those shooters didn't even listen to Marilyn Manson. They listened to music that was similar, like Rammstein, KMFDM, but not Manson. But Manson was the easy scapegoat at that time because he was the most visible, especially in the U.S. So yeah, there will always be scapegoats for this kind of thing, and it is I think a lot right now that we see with what has happened in the past that we have labeled in hindsight as moral panics, right? This kind of societal panic, anxious response to something that we think is happening culturally. That's this phenomenon that we need to like crack down on. We see a lot that with pornography today, of like these very, very generalized, hyperbolic claims of porn effects that don't focus on nuance at all, and just have these sweeping generalizations that all porn is going to cause these effects. And like, we know that's not true.
So we talked about masturbation addiction earlier. What about porn addiction? Because that's also something that a type of claim that we hear from anti-porn feminists and other kinds of, for example, religiously motivated people when they blame porn for this and that kind of thing. I mean, is there such a thing, or is it? Or is the problem again related to moral incongruence?
Yeah, the latter. So everything that we talked about with masturbation addiction applies to porn addiction. And in fact, the research actually doesn't do a great job of separating the two. They treat them as the same because, as one researcher has pointed out, porn is for masturbation. It's actually very rare for people just to kind of sit around and watch pornography and not use it for masturbation. That's why we call it porn use. Instead of just porn watching, what are we using it for? We're using it to masturbate, right? And we don't use that for other media either. We don't say Netflix use. We say we're watching Netflix, not using Netflix. So even the language that we have around porn indicates that and implies that it is for masturbation, and it's difficult to tease those two apart. And that creates a problem with the research, because everything that we know about porn addiction, is it really about porn, or is it just about masturbation? And some of the studies that try to differentiate between the two have found that masturbation is actually more of the ingredient that is leading to some effects or non-effects than the porn itself. And I certainly have seen that clinically, as I was mentioning before, that for couples who are struggling with one of their porn use, well, take porn out of the equation, but they're still masturbating. Are the problems still there? Yeah, they're still there, right? So yeah, the mechanisms behind porn addiction are very, very similar to what we were talking about with masturbation addiction.
But clinically, I mean, from a clinical psychology perspective, medically, is there anything that can be harmful about watching porn, consuming porn, masturbating to porn, anything like that?
Nothing that can be said definitively of like, absolutely, you watch this kind of porn, this is what's going to happen to your brain, to your body, to your behavior. There's no research to suggest that. The best things that we have would be like correlational studies that show like just a relationship between two variables, not necessarily cause effect. And this is where that scientific literacy is so important, because there is one famous study that came out several years ago in Germany that looked at gray matter in the brain through brain imaging. I think it was MRI specifically, and how that related, the amount of gray matter in their brain, and how that related to the participants' porn use. And what they found is that the more porn that the participants consumed, the lower amount of gray matter that they had, as evidenced from these MRI scans. And of course, anti-porn people, anti-masturbation people run with that headline of like, porn causes brain damage. Porn causes decrease of gray matter in the brain. It's like, one, the study's designed, the methodology, you can't conclude that. It's not cause effect. We have a relationship between two variables, and a very interesting relationship, right? And that, yeah, as one goes up, one goes down. But it could be the opposite direction. It may not be the porn causing the differences, all right? If we could test this in an experimental way where we could more infer causality, one possible scenario is that, yes, more porn causes decreases in gray matter in the brain. Or it could be that decreases in gray matter in the brain lead to people watching more pornography. Maybe it's sensation seeking, stimulation seeking, something like that, right? But it started with the lower gray matter. It wasn't the porn that caused it. Or often the case with these correlational studies is some third variable or fourth variable, fifth variable that's not even part of the study, that wasn't examined or assessed, that's contributing to both the decreases in gray matter and the increases in pornography watching, right? And so the two aren't actually directly related. There's no cause effect between the two. It's something else causing both in the individual, right? That one study, we don't know. We cannot conclude the directionality of that relationship. And furthermore, for just this as an example for this one study, because this study gets cited a lot, anytime you see porn use causes brain damage and they do have a citation, more than likely it's this study. So I like to dissect it a lot. The most important thing to me, other than the directional problems that we can't infer, is that the study was done on 64 men, which was a fine sample size, especially dealing with like brain imaging, right? Those are pretty intensive studies. But all 64 men in the study were completely healthy. There were no functional impairments. There were no observable cognitive impairments. There was no psychiatric disorders present, anything like that. So they were all healthy men, regardless of the amount of porn that they watched. Even though they saw some differences in the brain scans, right? Those brain scans did not lead to any type of functional or cognitive impairment, making the brain scans kind of, I don't want to say inconsequential, but this is why you don't do kind of fishing expeditions with body imaging, right? And scanning, because you may find these kind of interesting things that are technically an anomaly, but there's no symptoms that go along with them. So you can't make sense as to the pathology of it, right? And so even with the lower brain gray matter brain volume, that has zero impact on these guys' lives. So it's like, well, what impact can we actually say that any of this is having, because this is 64 healthy men?
Yeah. So what do you make then of anti-porn crusaders? Because, I mean, of course, I could ask you to comment on the more moral side of things, which is something that many times anti-porn feminists come up to the table with. I mean, with moral kinds of arguments, and then we could get into a conversation about the porn industry and things like that. But of course, I don't imagine that you are an expert on that. And I'm not sure if you're even interested in the more moral or political side of pornography. But from the perspective of a psychologist, what do you think of anti-porn crusaders and their claims?
Well, from a therapeutic perspective, if a patient comes in saying that they're anti-porn, it's not me to judge that or change their mind, right? If they're coming from it from whatever ideological perspective, like that's their value system, and right, and they have to accept patient autonomy with that. So it's more of an issue when it comes into the political arena of like, oh, I feel this way about porn, so therefore no one should watch it. It should be illegal. There should be all these restrictions placed on it because I believe it's bad, right? And that's when you can start pushing back, be like, is it bad? What are you basing that off? And will these restrictions actually reduce the effects that you think this is having, right? Or is this just more state involvement in media? And is that a good thing, right? Overall for free speech issues, right? So there are a lot of ideological issues that can come into it, but also these ideological issues often rely on scientific arguments to support their ideology, especially in the realms of public policy. And that's when you can kind of push back. So my belief of it, kind of looking at the big picture, is kind of what we've kind of talked about a little bit sometimes, is that being anti-porn is largely missing the point. And it's largely scapegoating something that actually has very little to do with, or is a small piece of what you're actually concerned about. So if you're concerned about violence, right, but you're hyper focused on pornography, and you want to ban pornography because you think it leads to violence, and just general violence, not violence necessarily only to women, but violence among like men, that it's just creating violent behavior.
Yeah.
It's like, well, is pornography really the best thing to go after, right? The top priority to go after. There's a lot of other media that have violent content in that we can regularly consume openly, and we don't have to secretly consume it. Go onto YouTube and you can watch the most violent videos imaginable. Real life violence, not simulated, even aggression within maybe like a BDSM scene in porn. But we can live stream essentially wars going on all over the world, right? Is that more of a concern about having an influence on violent behavior than pornography? Personally, as just my opinion, I think it should be, right? And that's why I think, like, so what is it about porn actually that gets you so upset that you think this is the top priority to address your issue that you're so concerned about? And I think it really does come down to just a discomfort with sex in general, a discomfort of seeing that so blatantly displayed in pornography that it creates a lot of discomfort. I think, even if a casual person is pretty comfortable with the idea of pornography, they may watch it from time to time. But if pornography, was shown to them in an environment that they're not used to seeing it, it would be very shocking and embarrassing and maybe possibly even shameful. They would feel guilty about it. It stirs up a lot of emotions because of the cultural taboos that many cultures have about sex in general, and hear sex displayed on the screen, right? And then we start thinking about, well, this can't be healthy, right? I'm having this reaction to it, even though I thought of myself as a sex positive person. This is like too much, right? There's too much sex, because it's close-ups of genitals, or I don't like the position that they're in. That looks a little too aggressive. Are they consenting to this? Let's look at the workplace conditions, right? So then it kind of gets into a workers' rights issue. But all these things can get stirred up in the individual that they feel uncomfortable about, and they project that onto the media, saying that the media is harmful and other people are going to be more harmed by it. If I'm feeling this way, oh my goodness, what's a 19-year-old going to feel when they see this, right? That's going to be detrimental. So it's a lot of assumptions based on a projection of our own discomfort with seeing explicit depictions of people fucking.
Okay, so I was going to ask you just one last question, but something else came to my mind that I think it's also interesting to address here, particularly because now, and I don't want you to comment on the technological side of things specifically, but now in the UK, for example, there are people pushing for laws to try to that basically force people to identify themselves online to try to reduce porn consumption or the exposure of children to porn.
Yeah, the age verification.
Yeah, the age verification and all of that. But just from purely a psychological perspective, I know this is going to be a very controversial question, particularly even more so for conservative people. But are there negative psychological effects of children and adolescents watching porn or watching people having sex or anything like that?
Yeah, so the way the research can be done ethically is that we can't have experimental studies to look at cause effect, right? There's no institutional review board at any university that is going to greenlight a study where you're taking a bunch of 14-year-olds into a room, showing them pornography, and then measuring outcomes afterwards. That study is just not going to be approved. So at best, you have to rely on correlational research, which can provide some information on things. But again, we're just showing relationships between two things, not necessarily a causal relationship. Just two things vary with one another. Sure. So with that, some of the research that I've seen is they're from my perspective, and why I've largely avoided correlational research in my own career, because I don't like the problem of those third variables, those unexplained third variables that could explain relationships, causal relationships, especially within media studies. Because when you look at if there's any type of relationship that's established between early exposure to pornography and some type of negative outcome, health outcome, behavioral outcome, things like that. Like, well, what else is going on, right? And a big one that often gets overlooked, it has been studied and controlled for in some instances and has been pointed to as a key factor, is parental supervision, right?
Mm.
And so those with less parental supervision oftentimes have greater access to a whole host of different types of media,
Yeah.
and media that's designed and made for adults and that they're going to be watching anyways, and certain negative health outcomes or behavioral outcomes. It's like, well, is it the media that's contributing to those outcomes, or more so the lack of supervision that could be independently related to those outcomes as well,
Mhm.
right? So there's, for me, the research is too muddy to make big conclusions, especially definitive conclusions of like, yeah, if you're 15 years old and you come across a pornography link and you click on that link, this is what to expect to your health, to your behavior, to your psychological well-being. There's no research that can answer that definitively.
Okay. So I have one last question then, because this is something that you talk about at the very end of your book. Who are the sex educators and the moderates fighting back against the anti-masturbation crusaders? And I mean, why do you think sex education is important when it comes to how people deal with masturbation and
Mhm.
things like that?
Yeah, so I'd say this is definitely within our domain, right? So any type of mental health provider, psychologists, social workers, counselors, therapists who specialize in sexual health, sexual behavior, sexual disorders, this is definitely within our domain. We're the experts
Yeah.
in this. We're the most comfortable with this behavior. We're least likely to have a lot of negative feelings come up when talking about sex that could be projected in a way that's kind of hyperbolic or overgeneralizing to things, and engaging in scare tactics. Doesn't say it doesn't happen even within our own field. It's just we have more training that's less likely to happen. So this
Mhm.
is definitely within our wheelhouse to address, and I think we should be addressing it, because there's a lot of misinformation out there, and it's like a trying to use like a leaf blower against a tsunami. You're not going to stop that wave from coming in, but the best we can do is try to be consistent enough in our messaging that maybe somebody somewhere will hear it and understand, like, okay, what messaging should I actually believe on this? The one that's coming from those with expertise in this, or some random person with a podcast who's spouting nonsense and selling supplements, and who promises if you masturbate less, you're going to gain 500% in your testosterone. It's like, hopefully, intuitively, that does not make sense that would be the case. Obviously, they have ulterior motive to sell their supplements, sell their motivation coaching sessions, things like that. So maybe we need to start looking for more credible sources of where we get our information as it relates to masturbation. So there's been a lot of these pro masturbation crusaders and proponents throughout history. One of the biggest ones from the 70s was Betty Dotson. She was just an educator. But the more recent ones too, I always like to point to, is Dr. David Ley. He's a psychologist, and Dr. Nicole Prouse. I believe she's a neuroscientist, and they do a
Yeah,
lot.
I've had
Mhm.
her on my show. Yeah.
Oh, great. Yeah. Yeah. Both of them have done great work in this area of pushing back against misinformation and pushing back against a lot of the claims of NoFap, semen retentionists, and things like that. And they have the experience and the publications to back it up.
Mhm. Great. So the book is again DIY, The Wonderfully Weird History and Science of Masturbation. I'm leaving a link to it in the description of the interview. And Dr. Sprankle, just before we go, apart from the book, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Sure. On social media, I'm on Instagram and Twitter at Dr. Sprankle, and then also just on my website, drsprankle.com.
Great. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a very fascinating conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Forte, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alni Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.